Hey, this is Joshua from the church at Mon River. Thanks for taking time to listen to this teaching. It's our mission here to make followers of Jesus who see individuals, families, and neighborhoods restored to God's design, and we hope that this recording helps accomplish this purpose in your life today.
CSB version. This is 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 through 16. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to leave her husband. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. But I, not the Lord, say to the rest, if any brother has an unbelieving wife, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. Also, if any woman has an unbelieving husband, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce her husband. For the unbelieving husband is made holy by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let him leave. A brother or a sister is not bound in such cases. God has called you to live in peace. Wife, for all you know, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife.
We are pausing our study on the life of King David in 1 and 2 Samuel to do a 3-week study looking at singleness and marriage. Certainly addressing everyone in the room on these topics. Last week we looked at a biblical view of singleness. You can find that lesson online. Today we're going to see a biblical view of marriage. Let's to consider what are some of the things in our life that have shaped our view of marriage. Certainly for all of us, our parents' marriage has shaped us. This may be something that's good and maybe something not so good. I think about for me, my parents have been married for 42 years now, but my sisters and I, we unfortunately saw a lot of conflict in our home growing up. So it's not so much a marriage that me or my sisters want to imitate. Also think about how pop culture can shape our view of marriage. Think about TV shows and movies that we watch. Think about movie stars or other leaders in our culture. For many of these figures, they've been married 5 different times. So we probably don't want to intimidate or imitate their marriages either. But we can also be influenced by popular marriage books, but most of these have only been out for 5 or 10 years. Maybe you've been influenced by fairy tales that you read growing up. Give you a picture of a fairy tale wedding or this fairy tale living happily ever after. These views of marriage certainly aren't based on reality. Today, I want to give us a different view of marriage, one that is given in the Bible. I want you to consider God who created us, God who created marriage, and see what He has to say about it. In the book, The Meaning of Marriage by Tim Keller, he points out that all human institutions that we are part of, is only the family and the church that are clearly defined for us in the Bible. Think about that. There's nothing that the Bible has to say about how schools should be run. Nothing in the Bible about how government should be structured, or how hospitals should function, or businesses should be organized. The Bible has much to say about marriage. See, in the 2nd chapter of the Bible, there's a wedding between Adam and Eve there in Genesis chapter 2. And in the 2nd to last chapter of the Bible, there's also a wedding there in Revelation chapter 21. There's much that the Bible has to say about marriage and all the space between those two. Today, the main point that I have is we'll see that the Bible defines marriage as a lifelong covenant between a man and a woman. Marriage is a lifelong covenant between a man and a woman. We'll first look at this definition and what it all entails. We'll see how this principle is drawn out from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, passage we just read, as well as other parts of the Bible. We'll see how this view of marriage can help married couples in the room have a lasting marriage, give a beautiful picture of marriage for singles who aspire towards it. Before we get into 1 Corinthians chapter 7, I want us to dive into this statement right now. What does it mean that marriage is a covenant? May not be too familiar with this word covenant, but a covenant is a solemn commitment between two people guaranteeing certain promises. Sort of like a contract, if you think about buying a house or some business agreement. The difference is that instead of it being a legal nature, covenant is divine in nature. Most of the covenants that we see in the Bible are this divine commitment between God and man. We saw in our study in the life of King David that God made a covenant with David, promised him that one of his descendants would always sit on the throne. Other covenants really popular is the one that God made with Abraham, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. This particular covenant is sealed by the sign of circumcision. We also see covenants in the Bible as divine commitments between two different people. Think back in our study of David, we saw Jonathan make a covenant with young David. He promised to be faithful to him despite his father Saul trying to kill him. Jonathan specifically said in that covenant that he made that commitment before God. The Bible also describes marriage as a divine commitment between a man and a woman. You see this in Malachi chapter 2. It says that a man has a wife by covenant, and that God was the witness between a husband and a wife being joined together. Proverbs chapter 2, it speaks of this adulterous woman. It says that she abandons her husband for another, and she forgets the covenant of her God. You see in the Bible, the seal of this covenant between a man and a woman is the man or woman leaving their parents, becoming one flesh with their spouse. This is called the consummation, the finalization of the marriage covenant. Now, for some, this sort of covenant language of marriage, it might be new to you, but just think about the traditional Christian wedding vows. I, Joshua, take you, Angela, to be my wife, and I promise and covenant before God and these witnesses to be your loving and faithful husband, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as we both live. Traditional wedding vows, they also have the language of covenant in the exchange of rings. The rings are a sign of the covenant that is being made. Now, maybe you've heard marriage described as a covenant before, you've picked up on this language, but maybe you haven't fully considered what the implications of that are. First, this means that marriage is sacred. Marriage is not just this civil union between two consenting adults. Marriage is holy matrimony. Now, marriage doesn't make us holy. The act of it doesn't change our standing before God. In fact, we saw last week that the Bible actually highlights singleness over marriage. Marriage is holy in the sense that it's a commitment between you and your spouse before God. The significance in the ceremony of marriage should be performed by a pastor before Christian witnesses. There's also a significance in the couple's intimacy together. It's not just for pleasure and procreation. This act is sealing the two people together. Think about a friend of mine that I coach baseball with. He's been with his partner for over 12 years. They have children together. They've purchased a home together. They've never been married. They have a civil union together legally in the eyes of the court, but they're not married. One day we were having a very real conversation with each other, and I just asked him, I said, hey, how come you've never gotten married to Katie? He told me, he said, well, I just don't see a need to get married. You know, this is a view that I actually respect. Seeing it as marriage is a divine commitment created by God. If they don't believe in God, then what's the point of getting married? On the opposite of that, we're willing. We might have pleasure to marry George and Rachel here in this room in a few months. We do this before the witness of many of you. The climax of this event is not when we go to a back room and we sign the documents that are provided to us by the state of Pennsylvania. It's when they make a divine commitment together, as expressed in these vows. The fact that marriage is a covenant also means that marriage is weighty. Marriage is something that's very weighty. It's not something that we do for fun when we're in love and then we disregard when it's not so fun. There's a divine weight to marriage. Think back to those wedding vows. It's the covenant that holds the two people together through good times and hard times. This is not a relationship that's built on what I receive from it. If you have a good job, you financially provide, then I'll stay with you. No. We're committed together in plenty and in want. It's not just based on something that I receive that, you know what, if you make me feel warm and fuzzy on the inside, you bring me joy and happiness, then I'll stay with you. No, we're committed in joy and sorrow. Marriage is not just something where, you know what, if you physically remain in the same shape that you are when we got married, well, then I'll stay with you. No. Committed to each other in sickness and in health. Two people coming together and they're bonded together not by their circumstances, but by the commitment that they make to each other. As long as they both shall live. We'll see how this principle comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Saw last week that Paul had started the church in Corinth, and they had written him a letter asking him a bunch of different questions. And news about what we see here, that some of those questions have to do with divorce. He writes in response to them in this letter. This is what Paul writes. To the married I give this command. Not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to leave her husband. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. Paul's equally addressing men and women here. To make his point, he references the words of Jesus. He says, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. Let's look at what Jesus had to say on this topic of marriage. This is taught in Matthew chapter 19, very similar words to what Paul's saying here. So what Jesus said when he was teaching his disciples on the Sunday, he says, haven't you read that he who created them in the beginning made them male and female? And he also said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Just think about it. Paul referenced Jesus, and here Jesus is referencing creation. It's pointing back to God's original design for marriage. He concludes his thought by saying this: therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. What God has brought together in this sacred marriage covenant, let no one separate. All of the scriptures, from the very beginning of the scriptures to Jesus to Paul, they're all consistent in view that marriage is a lifelong covenant between a man and a woman. Just like today, though, this view that Jesus was teaching was very countercultural. This week in my studies, I read this really odd teaching from one of the Jewish sects in the day. And it said that a man can divorce his wife if he finds any indecency in her. Specifically said that even if she ruins a meal, he has right to divorce her. Jesus is coming, he's teaching his disciples a very different view of marriage. You see that in this conversation, that his disciples, they sort of press back on this statement that Jesus makes. Jesus responds to them with this. He says, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because of the hardness of your hearts. But it was not like that from the beginning. I tell you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. Jesus is emphasizing the weightiness of marriage. He says that two people can choose to separate. They can even do so legally. But the covenant that they made before God is still there. So much so that if the divorced husband or wife remarries, they're committing adultery. Now, while marriage is certainly intended to be a lifelong covenant, we do see some three different conditions that can break the marriage covenant. The first is more obvious, that's death. That's what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It says, a wife is bound as long as her husband is living. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to anyone she wants, only in the Lord. A widow can get remarried. She just needs to get married to someone who's a fellow Christian. The second of these conditions that can break the marriage covenant is what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 19. He said that sexual immorality breaks the marriage covenant. The husband or wife becoming one flesh with someone other than their spouse. This frees the other person from their original covenant. And the last thing Paul gives us here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, this is what he writes. But if the unbeliever leaves, let him leave. A brother or sister is not bound in such cases. God has called you to live in peace. You think about the circumstances, the church at Corinth, the good news of salvation in Jesus, that it just recently came to the city. There would likely have been many situations where one spouse just became a follower of Jesus and the other was not. Just think about the type of friction that this can cause in a home. Two people are trying to live together, but they're serving two different masters. Some of you, this may be your marriage. Maybe you grew up in a home that was like that. Paul is saying that if the non-Christian walks away from the marriage, the Christian is no longer bound to that marriage covenant. He says, let the non-Christian walk away for the sake of peace. You can jump in and read this on your own later, but he clarifies this exception in verses 12 through 16. He says that having an unbelieving spouse is not a reason for divorce in and of itself. It's the hope that the unbelieving spouse would come to faith in Christ because of the faithful witness of the Christian in the marriage. Think about how Peter, he says that the spouse might be won over by the way they live. But if the unbeliever abandons the relationship and their desire to be with the Christian because they're now living very different than how they did before, the Christian is no longer bound to that marriage covenant. And I just want to add this as we think about all of this, biblical reasons for breaking a marriage covenant. While the Bible doesn't allow for divorce in these situations, we also have to acknowledge that this is not God's design. Jesus, he said back there in Matthew 19 when he was talking about the exception, he says, this is because of the hardness of your hearts. Because sin has entered the world, there is adultery, abuse, and neglect, and division. But this is not God's design in the beginning. While divorce is allowed in some situations, it should still grieve us. It should be avoided if at all possible. So let's think about some application of all this for us this morning. One, I want to invite us to have a high view of marriage. Have a high view of marriage. While the covenant of marriage comes with a weightiness, also is something that's very beautiful. Sharing your life with someone who has a sacred commitment to you. This is something to be celebrated and pursued, not avoided. Think about how our culture encourages young people to delay marriage. Delay marriage until they finish school or get a career job or buy a house. All the while, many are living with their boyfriend and girlfriend, acting as if they're married without the commitment of marriage. Yes, being broke as newlyweds does add stress to marriage. But you know what else adds stress to a relationship? Not having this kind of commitment from the person that you're with. Just last weekend, a family was at the pool and saw a single friend of mine and was there just chasing after all of these women at the pool. And in the midst of this, Angela, she looks at me and she says, Joshua, I'm so glad that I don't have that pressure and that stress of dating. She's telling me that there's peace in knowing that I'm committed to her. Yes, there's certainly a thrill in the dating process. There's far greater unity in the covenant of marriage. Tim Keller, in the meaning of marriage, he asked this question. He said, which is truer love? Which is truer love? The new couple that comes together in passion and romance at the very peak of their feelings, yet have only seen certain parts of the person that they're with. They're blinded by their feelings to the parts of that person that they choose to not see. Which is true love, right? The couple that's been together for 10, 20, 50 years may not have the same passion as that newly dating couple. They've seen every bit of the person they're with, good and wrong. And they still choose to be with that person. they still choose to love them. Is that not the true love? The love that we should all desire to have? What holds our marriages together is not feelings, passion. It's not a legal document. It's our covenant to one another. This is far more beautiful. For the married couples in our church, let us display this version of marriage to the world around us. First, I call you to have a high view of marriage. Second, have a high view of sex. In the Bible's view of marriage, when you give yourself to someone else, you are literally making yourself one flesh with that person. This is the act that God has given to consummate a marriage covenant. We live in a culture that has cheapened sex. There's apps that are designed to facilitate random hookups. We see all sorts of random hookups on nearly every TV show and movie that we watch. These images and experiences of sex outside of the marriage covenant, they rob us of the beauty that God has designed for sex to be. Both single and married people in this room call you to guard your bodies, guard your minds. Hebrews chapter 13 says that marriage is to be honored by all, and the marriage bed is to be kept undefiled. Why? Because God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterers. Because marriage is a covenant in the eyes of God, God has a greater judgment on those who break that covenant. So, we should keep the marriage bed undefiled. Give yourself only to the man or woman that you have covenanted with. The last application that I have for us is having you been hired to do with Jesus. Having you been hired to do with Jesus. While marriage is a lifelong covenant, it is only for this life. Marriage is not eternal. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 22 that in the resurrection, there will not be marriage between a man and a woman. We look at the Bible, we see that the earthly marriages that we may experience is just an image of what is to come, pointing forward to the marriage between Jesus and his followers. The marriage where Christ is the groom, made an everlasting covenant with us, his bride, that if we believe in him, if we commit to him, he will make us his own, his dearly loved. Christ, our groom, has sealed this covenant with his blood on the cross. His blood makes sinful and rebellious people pure and spotless, clothed in white wedding garments, just like the bride walking down the aisle. Our groom, he has promised to bring us into his eternal home and give us everlasting peace. He is now preparing for us a seat at the wedding feast of the Lamb. Oh, may we fix our eyes first and foremost on this eternal marriage. Next week, we will see that when we follow after Jesus with all of our hearts, it actually makes our current marriages work so much better.
Thanks for listening to this teaching. If you'd like to take a next step in following Jesus with the church at Mon River, we invite you to go to atmonriver.com and click on the Connect With Us button in the upper right-hand corner. May God bless you with the grace and peace of Jesus Christ our Lord.